17 years ago, I had a decision. I could be happily married, or I could play video games. Now, some of you are saying, Kyle, did your wife hate video games that much? Not then, but maybe now. But really, I loved video games that much. You see, I grew up as a latchkey ADD kid who got to watch as much screen time or play as much video games as I wanted. And it was so good because if I wanted to stimulate, it was all there all the time. And I knew this about myself. And so not only did I stop playing video games, except for weekend with the boys. But anyway, other than that, we also had no TV in our house for the first 9 years that we were married, because there's this thing that I knew, it just calls to me. And it's like the ring. Give it to me. Sorry, bad Lord of the Rings reference. If you're a nerd, thanks for laughing. If you're not a nerd, sorry, you're not a nerd, good for you. And then something happened. We had children, and they could watch screens. And then eventually, they got old enough to play video games. Praise the Lord. Now I'm no longer a deadbeat dad or a checked out husband. I am a good father who plays video games with his children. And sometimes too much. And so there's this phrase that we have in our house. We call it video game crazy. It's when all you want to do or talk about is the video game, and everything else you're doing seems not as much fun because nothing else can give you the dopamine that video game does. And so there's times where we have had to take a pause on these video games. And I wanted to model this for my kids, so I said, hey, a daddy will do the pause with you. And so we stopped playing video games at home because I still had the game on my mobile device. And sometimes, you're in the restroom, you got 5 minutes between breaks, or you found a really bad excuse to play. And so I asked myself this question does it really matter if I play and they don't know about it? Is it a big deal if I'm playing, but I'm not going video game crazy? Does it really matter if nobody knows and it doesn't hurt anybody? Does it matter if what I do in private does not hurt anybody? You see, this is the question I've asked, and you maybe have asked that. Maybe it's about video games, maybe it's about something else. And you've asked yourself, is it a big deal if it doesn't hurt anybody? And this question that I had, that I've wrestled with and still do, is answered in this text that we're gonna look at that's 3,000 years old, about this question of what we do in private, how does it impact what we do in public? And not only how does it impact us, but how does it impact those around us? So if you're with me this morning, let's take a look at a scripture today in Joshua chapter 7, where we ask this question: how does what we do in private impact what we do and who we are and how we impact others in public? Joshua chapter 7, here's the story. About 500-600 years before this, God made a promise to Abraham that one day this was gonna be the promised land for his people. So here we are hundreds of years later, and they have just crossed over the sea and just had the greatest victory. They just defeated the biggest, most fortified town called Jericho. Jericho had the biggest army, the biggest walls, and it was the first thing they saw when they crossed over this river. And it was the biggest military obstacle. And once they did it, they were on cloud 9. It was like a team that had just won the Super Bowl or Niners midseason last year, where we felt like we're unbeatable, we can't beat anybody. Anyone else have been there? Okay. And in the middle of that high of look at us, of look how good God is, and all of this happens in Joshua chapter 7, verse 1. But the Israelites were unfaithful in regards to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zimri, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Now Joshua sent men from Jericho, that's where they just had this big city, to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, up to the east of Bethel, and told them, go up and spy out the land. So the men went up and spied out Ai. When they returned to Joshua, they said, not all the army needs to go up against Ai. Send 2,000-3,000 men to take it. And do not weary the whole army for a few people who live up there. So 3,000 went up, but they were routed by the men of Ai, who killed 36 of them. They chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries and struck them down on the slopes. And at their hearts, the people melted in fear. Their hearts became like water. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord. Again, that's what we talked about last week, where God chose to dwell. So in God's presence, he's tearing his clothes as a sign of mourning, remaining there till evening. The elders of the Lord did the same, sprinkled dust on their heads. Again, it's like wearing black when we mourn. It's the same principle. And Joshua said in verse 7, "Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites, to destroy us? If only we'd been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan." Pause. Get this. They defeat Jericho and they are riding high. Then they go and lose 36 precious men to this one little town called Ai. And now Joshua is saying this: God, why did you bring us here in the first place? Couldn't we have just stayed on the other town, on the other side of the Jordan, where we wouldn't have to contest these folks? God, why did you do this? You been there? You're at a church service or you're at camp, you have a spiritual high, like, I believe in God, I'm gonna go for it, whatever God says, I'm gonna do it, and I trust him. And then 3 days later, you're like, God, why? God is so good, he could do anything. And then you get a diagnosis or have that discussion with someone, you're like, God, I just wanna quit. Warning, for those of you who are in leadership, this will be a thing. There will be people who say they wanna go with you, and then others will wanna quit. And if you're a leader, you will as well. Joshua is God's chosen man here. He's seen countless miracles, and even he wants to quit. Why? What happened? How do you go from defeating Jericho to losing to this little town? Verse 10. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Stand up. What are you doing face down? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I've commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. And they've put them in their own possession." That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemy. They turned their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. Essentially, God said, whatever the plunder is there in Jericho, it belongs to God, as a sign that God is the one who won the battle for us. And everything we have, the first thing we do is always give our first and our best to God. And then after that, God says, I will entrust you with it. But this thing had to be devoted, and they didn't do it. Verse 13, go consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourself in preparation for tomorrow, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are devoted things among you, Israel. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them. Verse 14, in the morning, present yourselves tribe by tribe. The tribe the Lord chooses shall come forward, clan by clan. The clan the Lord chooses shall come by family. And the family the Lord chooses shall come forward man by man. Whoever is caught with the devoted things, shall be destroyed by fire, along with all of them. He has violated the covenant of the Lord and has done an outrageous thing in Israel. Early the next morning, Joshua had Israel come forward tribe by tribe, and Judah was chosen. Of the clans that came forward, Zerahite was chosen. Of the clan of the Zerahites, the family that came forward was Zimri was chosen. Joshua had his family come forward man by man. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zimri, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah was chosen. Whoa. Could you imagine what this is like? Imagine I showed up here on a Sunday morning and said, hey, good morning, my name's Kyle, I'm one of the pastors here, and one of you have committed sin that's impacting those around you. And I'm not sure who it is, but God's going to reveal it. So I want everyone in this section to stand up. Don't do it. All right. The front half, stay standing. Back half, you're safe. Someone in the back is like, all right, good, he didn't get caught. Okay, or at least not yet. Okay, I'm good. And then, all right, first row, sit down. Last row, sit. And I get to this middle row and this whole family's standing together like, oh, which one of you did it? And I point and I say, it was you. Could you imagine what's going on? Imagine the shame of this happening in front of all these other people. Imagine the shame of this. Imagine the shame of him knowing or not knowing or wondering, did those 36 men who I fought with in battle, who were my brothers on the battlefield just a few days ago in Jericho, did they fall and did they die because of what I did? And now, what's gonna be the consequence for my family? And in this moment, I wanna pause and ask these two questions. The first is this, it's our big question, is how is what is done in private impact what is done in public? But there's this second question that we're gonna get to, because some of you, you're not gonna be able to take the first question seriously because you have serious questions that are on the second one. The second one says, is this just? Is this fair? Why did 36 people die because of this one man's sin? Why does Achan's entire family get punished? Is this right and just? If God is a God of justice, this doesn't seem fair, right? So let's talk about both, but let's first ask this question. What does the private have to do with the public? As I've thought about how we'd have this conversation this morning, there was lots of things I could think about. There's a smattering of topics that happen in private. Maybe it's the way you think or feel towards yourself or someone else. Maybe it's words that you said to a friend that we thought were in private because it's just the two of you who knew. Maybe it's a condition of your heart where you think you've got everything together and you don't. And of all these things I could talk about, it was pretty clear that there was one topic that we, as a church family, as a pastor who loves you and is for you, I know we've got to talk about. So this morning, let me just take a moment to illustrate the private-public relationship by taking a few minutes and talking about pornography. Now somebody said, well, why that one? Well, because the studies show that probably 70% of men in this room and roughly 40% of women engage in pornography in some degree. Some of you are surprised by that women number. It's interesting, as I told someone in our church that I was preparing this sermon, she said, are you gonna talk to women about pornography? And I'm like, this feels awkward. I feel like I'm in trouble. And she said, you have to, because I was addicted to pornography and I thought it was only men, and the shame that came by thinking I was the only one was so great. I need my sisters to know that they're not the only ones and that there can be freedom. So, is what you do in private really that big of a deal? Does something like pornography doesn't hurt anyone, right? Well, this is what some researchers tried to figure out, both from Stanford and from Harvard. And what they did is they did brain scans while folks were engaging in pornographic content. And so there's this part of the brain that is responsible for, or the center of pleasure and joy and happiness sensation. And the theory, the hypothesis that these researchers had is that when people looked at this content, those who engaged more often would have a larger pleasure center in the brain. And when they did the brain scans, they actually found out that they had a smaller part of the brain, that it shrunk. Why? Because it had been overtasked and overused, it had shrunk and made it more difficult to experience pleasure, which led them to engage in more extreme content and not be able to find pleasure in other situations. Well, it's just private, right? It's just in their brain. It doesn't impact anyone, right? The studies went on to show that for some folks who engaged in the content, they began to see others as a means to an end, that they're a means of my fulfillment. Whereas others, it was the exact opposite. It was, I don't go and to have a more aggressive approach towards someone. I actually have a more passive approach. Why? Because A, I don't want to be rejected. And in the privacy of my own room, on my own screen or my own device, I can't be rejected. And so I avoid real life relationship. or even more so. And this is where I feel like this researchers from Stanford and Harvard add a lot, but there's something as a pastor I can add to this that I don't know if they've seen or not. The way that some folks withdraw is connected to the deep shame that people feel over sin. And the shame that, in my experience, people feel the greatest shame about is sexual sin. I have talked to people who were in jail because they've killed folks. And the way that God has shaped them and taken away their shame, I don't want to say it was easier. Yeah, it was easier than those I've talked to who sit with sexual shame, whether it be pornographic or inappropriate relationships. And why? Why would the shame be so powerful? Here's my theory. For some of us, we think that sex is just an itch that you scratch, a joy, something fun to happen. But really, when you're gonna take it seriously, when you're gonna look at it as an adult, you're gonna realize sex touches every part of your humanity. It touches your brain and your physiology, literally shapes your neuroplasticity, rewires your brain. It impacts your emotions, the way you feel about others and yourself. It changes the way you engage with other people. Literally changes the way your body functions. And it changes your relationship with God. Because that shame leads you to run from God's presence. Leads you to run from other people because shame says, if they knew, I don't know what they'd do. And we even hide from ourselves because we don't want to deal with it. And this is the power of shame, friends. Let me say, guilt is this. Guilt says, I did something bad, which is actually a good thing. Shame says, I am something bad, which is actually a terrible thing. So this thing that's done in private actually has a big public impact on us. So what do you do? Friends, I'm never gonna come here and just tell you the bad news. We believe that every single week we wanted to share with you the good news of Jesus. So let me just talk briefly about if you find yourself in the shame of any sin, but particularly sexual sin, let me tell you the prescription. And it could look different, but here it is. Shame loves to live, hide, and grow in darkness and isolation. And the antidote for it is to bring it out into the light and into public. James, Jesus' brother, writes a letter to the church, and he says this to them. He says, confess your sins to one another so that you can be healed. He goes on to say that the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. And some of you are like, this idea of for confessing my sin, can't I just do that between me and God? Why do I have to involve other people? Isn't just confessing between me and God enough? Doesn't that sound a whole lot better? Especially on a topic like this. And friends, I wish it was the case. But here's what happens. When you confess your sin to someone else who's trustworthy, who's a Jesus follower, who knows how to give you grace and truth, that's where the healing happens. When you come and bring what you think is the worst and they see it and that darkness comes into light and you realize the sky didn't fall, you're like, oh, okay. When they give you grace and truth, because here's the thing, some people are just gonna give you grace. And it's actually not that helpful. Grace may sound like this. Hey, bro, it's no big deal. Everyone does it. Every guy struggles with that way. It's no big deal. Just don't make it a problem. Grace. Truth says, what is wrong with you? Why would you do that? What's so disordered in your internal life that you... That's truth. That doesn't help. But light brings grace and truth. It's what God says, I love you, and I love you enough to empower you to change and be transformed. God says, I love you and see what's best in you, and I see that those desires are for something good and pure and beautiful, and this is a perversion. This is taking something good and it's becoming a means of evil, and I want you to be free from that. That is grace and truth. And when we walk in the light, it is free. As you know, as your pastor, if you've been here for any number of time, you know I'd much rather talk about my failures than my successes, because I think my failures give glory to Jesus. But let me just tell you this thing. as someone who lives in a life where I have no secrets, where my life is in the light and people know and they ask, the freedom that comes from that is amazing. That I never have to feel like I'm gonna walk in the room and someone's gonna find out, like, what happened? You're like, everybody already knows. What if your wife finds out? She already did. And here's the deal. With most shortcomings in my wife knows them before I do. And when I have friends who love me, who give me grace and truth, it's transformative. And I don't know what that looks like for you. Maybe you know that person. And I think you just need to text them and say, thank you for being that person. Some of you don't know if you have that person, so you've got to have this text message that says, hey, can we chat? There's something I want to talk about. And you've got to like wade, toe in the water, feel if that works. Some of you, maybe it looks like coming to Celebrate Recovery on Wednesday nights. Well, I'll tell you, at Celebrate Recovery, we see all sorts of transformation. Why? Because people are honest about their hurts, habits, and hangups. And they're honest about saying, I have problems in my life that I can't solve by my own. I need God, I need his truth, I need his people, and I need a community around me that supports me. And maybe that's it. Maybe for you, again, whether it's sexual sin or some others, maybe joining a small group is part of this. Because some of you are afraid if people knew the real me, whether it be the things I'd done or hadn't done or the questions I had about God or whatever that may be, would they actually love me? And actually being in this small group allows you to start living in the light. Clarification. Do not show up to the first week of your small group and talk about porn and sexual sin. I hope you get there one day. Probably not with a co-ed group. Live in the light. Don't skydive into the sun. Okay, there we go. Living in the light is transformative. Because when we live in darkness, we experience what Achan did. Achan realized that his sin not only cost him, but it cost him his family, it cost him 36 other folks. And what you need to know is what you do in private impacts those around you, especially those you love most. When I think, hey, if I play video games by myself, nobody notices, but then I'm still trying to find 5 minutes here to fit it in, you might call that video game crazy. And when your kids find out, which they're never gonna find out, right? Until you turn on the game and like, Dad, you've advanced levels. What have you been doing? I don't know. The Nintendo fairy came and just gave me levels. It's not Zelda, Dad. That doesn't work. Sorry. Bad joke. What happens in public or in private always becomes public and has a bigger impact on us than we realize. And what I want to do is give you freedom from that thing that that destroys you and let God transform it so you can live in light and freedom. So maybe that's after service you come and ask someone to pray for you. Maybe you start realizing, okay, I got to deal with this. But let me tell you, the path looks different, but it always goes from walking in darkness and shame to living in light and freedom. And there's no other way, friends. We have to do this together. Last bit. If someone in your small group sitting next to you shares something, pause, take a breath, and make sure you respond with grace and truth. Your first words should look like something like, I love you. Thank you for telling me. That must have been incredibly hard for you. And if that's all you do, that's great. But at some point, you have this gift that they've given you. Don't waste it. You get to be the means by which God transforms someone who loves you enough and trusts you enough to share the things that they don't want to admit to themselves, let alone say out loud. That is a sacred gift, and treasure it. And the best thing you can give them is grace and truth, so they can be free from what's destroying them in private. Now, some of you are like, okay, I'm getting there. But some of you are still struggling with this thing like, whoops, oh my goodness, we're good, just leave it. But some of you still have this question about, how come what Achan did impacts others? That doesn't seem just, fair, or right. Let's talk about that. 3 things. First is this. We live in an extremely individualistic world as a Westerner. We have individual identities. If you're part of an ancient Near Eastern culture as the day of the Bible, or even if you look at some of our East Asian friends, what you realize is there's a much more communal identity. And what you realize is that we become so hyper-individualistic, we think that the sin only impacts one person or should only impact one person. But if you're actually gonna take sin seriously, you realize that there's something about the family system that he was a part of that allowed him to do it. Now, I'm not saying that his parents raised him wrong and so he did it, but there was something there that gave birth to this idea, right? But it's also not just him. He's taking this plunder in the middle of a battle. He is not like alone privately where no one's there. There's all sorts of other soldiers who knew the commands and they saw it. And here's this other thing. What does it do? Again, if you keep reading the text, you'll see what he does is he goes and he pulls up from underneath his tent this plunder. What happens when he comes home that day and his kids are like, hey, Dad, where'd you get all that money? We've never seen gold in shekels like that. And is that a Babylonian robe? Wow, Dad, that fit is awesome. Where'd you get it? People in the house have to know. But there's a second piece. Okay, maybe I understand that individual sin has corporate consequence. Okay, but Kyle, shouldn't the punishment fit the crime? He stole. How come the punishment for stealing is death? That seems crazy, right? Well, maybe. You see, the Old Testament has 2 different ways of dealing with stealing. One way is if you steal something that impacts somebody else. Let me say it this way more clearly. If you steal someone else's ox, you have to repay that ox 5 times because the idea is they lost production and they couldn't plant, harvest their crops, do what they needed to do, so you pay back 5x. But if you steal something, let's say you steal a robe in this case, you don't pay back 5 times, you pay back 1/5, 20%. So if you steal $100, you pay back $120 because it's not productive, you didn't lose that. That's the consequence for stealing. So why in this case is it death? Because the sin isn't actually stealing. And as you look closely in the Hebrew, it'll become clear. What did God say? He said, don't take the devoted things. Let me show you what's happening in the Hebrew here. The Hebrew word here for devoted things, it's kerem. Again, if you're white like me, you may say cherem. If you're actually like an OG Semitic, you get that like guttural like kerem in there. And you hear it over and over, devoted, devoted, devoted. And then what does it say that Achan did? It said he coveted, or chamad, or shemad. There's this word play where both of them start with this very distinct vowel guttural sound that creates this word play that you've taken the devoted and now he's coveted it. The sin is not stealing. No. It's coveting. It's coveting is this, is in my heart, I want something so bad that I won't be okay if I don't have it. Coveting says this, in the deepest part of my place, when I want something, I can't be happy without it because God can't give me that joy. Coveting says, I have to take this for myself because God can't do it for me. Coveting says that I am more important and my rules are to be followed and my guidelines are because the law and ways of God are not good enough. Coveting is not simply a behavior thing. It's at the deepest part of your heart. You believe that you are God. I had this joke with a student once as she was trying to understand sin, and we kept going to the root of whatever sin it was, whatever root it was. Have you ever played that game where you ask why 5 times to get to the root of something? So I did this with her, and at the end of it, she said, why did you sin? And I said, it's because you think you're God. And so whenever she'd see me, she's like, hey, God here. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have taught you that. You see, here's the thing. God has come to give life, and sin has come to bring death. And sin brings death to you and to those around you, those you love and care about. And this is why the punishment is not just repay what you stole. It was saying his whole heart was corrupted. And if the story ended there, it would be bad news. But there's two more parts to the story. As the story goes on, all of Israel repents. It's not an individual thing. All of them come and they repent, and then they go to battle Ai. And what they do is they take 35,000 people this time, not 3,000, but 35,000 to go battle Ai. And what happens is they send 25 or 30,000 of them to go attack Ai, and then they retreat. And when they retreat, there's these 5,000 others who go in and invade the city. And then in the end, there's this detail that if you're not reading carefully, may mean nothing. It says that in Ai, 9,000 people died. What's the big deal, Kyle? The Israelites had just taken 3,000 to defeat them, thinking 3,000 would be enough. And now here they are, 9,000 dying. Why does that matter? What it's showing us is that sin hides our judgment and prevents us from seeing things clearly and creates a hubris that says, I can do it in my power. And this is this core thing. So they go and they have this battle, and then at the very end, there's this thing that happens. I gotta show it to you at the end of chapter 8. After they've repented, after they've won, verse 24, and we'll land the plane after this. When Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields in the wilderness and had chased them, when every one of them had been put to the sword, all the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. Oh, wait, sorry. Nope, that's what I just read. 25, sorry. Go forward. Here we go. All right, verse 30. Then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites. But he built according to what was written, the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no iron tool had been used. On it they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed fellowship offerings. All right, Kyle, what's the big deal here? It says that they used uncut stones. Why does this matter? You see, there's a sacrifice because they understand that the consequence for sin is death. And by God's grace is the sacrifice. Again, sacrifice an animal and let your sins be cast on that animal, symbolically, talking about how God forgives you. But uncut stones, why? This idea of uncut stones is incredibly important. And if you got to understand this to understand the heart of God, the heart of the Bible, the heart of the Christian faith is this. This idea of that being made with uncut stones is this reminder, this clear proclamation that salvation and forgiveness does not come by anything you can do with human hands. Nothing you can do can earn forgiveness or create salvation. Do you get that? This is why this idea of this sacrifice shoots forward a picture of what would happen 1,000 years after this, of when Jesus Christ himself, the God of the universe, would send his one and only son, Jesus Christ, to live the life we should have lived and died the death that we should have died. And here is the symbol that it's Jesus' sacrifice that forgives sins. Jesus is the devoted thing. The thing that was devoted to God, he lived an entire life devoted for God. And what did he do? He was sacrificed. If you read the story, you'll see that Joshua carries this javelin into it, and there's this javelin, it's this foreshadow, this picture of when Jesus would be stabbed in the side to make sure that he was dead. And into this, you wonder about justice. The reason that God is a God of justice is because he plays by his own rules. If he says the wages and the consequence of sin is death, he will play by those own rules, even if it means his one and only son, the one and only one who did not deserve death, will die in your place and my place, so our sin can be forgiven. Sin deserves death, and Jesus chose to die in your place. But remember, it's on uncut stones. It's nothing you did. It's nothing you earned. It's not because you went to church enough, prayed loud enough, gave enough, nothing. But this is the heart of the gospel, is that in the midst of God's beautiful plan, we sin and choose to worship ourselves and make the rules for ourselves. And instead of paying the price, Jesus paid the price for us so that we can live with him, not only today, but for eternity. What happens in public, what happens in private always goes public. Jesus' private faithfulness and obedience to God went public on the cross so that you and I could be saved by him and by him alone. And in this moment, I want you to feel the weight of your sin. Not because I'm trying to guilt you nor manipulate you, no. But I want you to feel the weight of your sin, that Jesus loved you so much that he would come and release you and lift that from you. But before that, I just want to invite everybody to a heartfelt response. In the most private place, with everyone head bowed, eyes closed. Maybe you're aware of what that sin is. Maybe you need to ask God to reveal it to you. But in this moment, take your sin very seriously, because God does as well. And take this moment to sit and to let the light of God begin to shine in the darkest places of our hearts.